May 5th, 2021. A hospice bed in Weymouth, Massachusetts, the same blue-collar town where it all started. George Jung is 78 years old, dying of liver and kidney failure. Outside, the world goes on. Inside that room, the man who once moved 85% of the cocaine coming into America takes his final breath. No bodyguards, no private jets, no duffel bags stuffed with cash, just an old man in a small house, broke, alone, watched over by hospice workers. The body that carried the weight of Pablo Escobar's American operation, quiet at last. This wasn't just another smuggler. This was the man Johnny Depp played, the man who turned the Medellin cartel's cocaine into the engine of the 1980s. The man who personally helped Pablo Escobar become the wealthiest criminal in human history. At his peak, George Jung was clearing $100,000 a day. He owned planes. He owned beaches. He owned the route. And then he lost every single dollar, every friend, every relative, his wife, his only daughter, and finally his freedom. This is the story of how a kid from a quiet Boston suburb walked into a federal prison cell in 1974 and walked out with the blueprint for the largest cocaine pipeline in American history. What the movie Blow got right, what it changed, and what really happened to George, Mirtha, little Christina, Tuna, and the men who built the operation that flooded America. Here's what most people never understood about George Jung. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't even particularly violent. He was a salesman, a logistics guy, and that's exactly what made him so dangerous. George Jacob Jung was born August 6, 1942, in Weymouth, Massachusetts, a working-class town south of Boston. His father, Frederick, ran a small heating oil business. His mother, Ermine, kept the house. George grew up on Abigail Adams Circle in a modest home where money was always tight. He watched his father work himself into the ground for almost nothing. He watched his mother walk out on the family more than once, and he made himself a promise. He was never going to be broke, never going to be small, never going to be invisible. In 1961, he graduated from Weymouth High School, football player, average student. Big smile, blonde hair, that all-American look that would later let him walk through airports nobody else could walk through. He drifted south to the University of Southern Mississippi for a few semesters. Then, in 1967, he packed up and headed west, Manhattan Beach, California. He was 24 years old. He had no plan. What he found on that beach changed the world. Marijuana, cheap, plentiful, and 10 times more expensive in Massachusetts than in California. George did the math in his head. He knew kids back in Boston who would pay anything for good West Coast weed. So he started flying it home, first in suitcases, then in surfboards hollowed out and sealed back up, then in the false floors of campers driven cross-country. By 1968, he had stewardesses, real flight attendants, walking duffel bags onto commercial flights from LAX to Logan Airport. He paid them a few $1,000s per trip. He was clearing more than that in a single afternoon. Then he met a Mexican supplier and the operation exploded. By 1971, George Jung was flying small planes loaded with marijuana out of Puerto Vallarta, 500 pounds at a time. Sometimes 600-700. He was 29 years old and making more money in a week than his father had made in his life. He told himself he was a folk hero, a Robin Hood of the counterculture. The truth was simpler. He had found the loophole, and he was greedy. Here's how the marijuana scheme worked. Step 1. George flew commercial down to Mexico. Step 2. He met his supplier in a beach town and locked in product at about $25 a pound. Step 3. A private pilot named Frank Shea flew a small twin-engine plane from a private airstrip in the Sierra Madres to a dry lake bed in the California desert. Step 4. Ground crews loaded the bricks into rental cars and station wagons. Step 5. The product hit Amherst, Boston, and the New England college market at over $200 a pound. Pure profit, tax-free, nobody to answer to. But here's the thing about getting rich fast. You start to believe you're untouchable. George got sloppy. In 1974, he was arrested at the Chicago airport carrying 660 pounds of marijuana. The judge offered him a deal. He skipped bail and ran, lived underground for months. Then they caught him again. And on a cold March day in 1974, George Jung walked into the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury, Connecticut. He thought his life was over. It had barely started. In that prison cell, he met a young Colombian-German kid named Carlos Enrique Leder Rivas, 24 years old, slim, manic energy, eyes that didn't sit still. Leder was doing time for a stolen car and minor smuggling charges. He read books by Adolf Hitler. He worshipped John Lennon. He hated Americans and loved American capitalism at the same time. He was, by every account, a little bit insane. The guards called him names. The inmates kept their distance. But George Jung looked at this strange Colombian kid and saw something nobody else saw. He saw a partner. For 16 months, they shared that cell. George taught Carlos everything he knew about American smuggling routes, how to bribe small airport managers, how to read radar gaps, how to load a plane so the weight distribution didn't tip off mechanics, how to launder cash through Florida real estate and Boston bars. Carlos, in return, told George something that stopped his breath. In Colombia, he said, there is a powder that costs $4,000 a kilo wholesale. In America, that same kilo sells for $60,000, cocaine. George did the math in his head, the way he had done it on Manhattan Beach years before. And in that prison cell, in 1974 and 75, the two of them sketched out, on yellow legal pads, the blueprint of what would become the Medellin cartel's American pipeline. They walked out of Danbury in 1976. Within 6 months, they had a small operation running cocaine out of Antioquia, Colombia, through the Bahamas into South Florida. Within a year, they were moving hundreds of kilos per shipment. And then Carlos Leder did something nobody had ever done before. He bought an island, Norman's Cay, a small private island in the Bahamas, 210 miles off the coast of Florida. Carlos systematically bought out or terrorized every resident until the entire island belonged to him and his crew. He built a refueling strip, a hangar, a radar tower, and a command house. Norman's Cay became the single most efficient cocaine transshipment point in the history of the trade. Colombian planes flew north loaded with product, landed on Norman's Cay, refueled, and small American pilots flew the final leg into Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas. The Bahamian government took bribes and looked away. The DEA knew, but for years they couldn't touch it. This was George Jung's golden age. Between roughly 1977 and 1984, he and Leder, working under the umbrella of Pablo Escobar's Medellin organization, were responsible for an estimated 85% of all cocaine entering the United States. Read that again. 85%. Not a slice. The market. The numbers from those years sound made up. They aren't. George Jung was clearing as much as $100,000 in a single day. On big shipments, his cut could reach $10 million. He once told an interviewer he had so much cash he had to store it in walls, in storage units, in the trunks of cars parked at long-term lots. He had homes in Mexico, in California, in Massachusetts. He flew private. He partied with movie stars. He met Pablo Escobar at Hacienda Nápoles, Escobar's private estate, and Escobar called him El Americano, the American, the man who could get product into the United States like nobody else. And it was around this time, 1977, that he met Mirtha Calderon. Born in Cuba, raised partly in Colombia, dark hair, fierce, beautiful, ambitious, she moved in the same circles. She loved the lifestyle. She loved the cocaine. They got married in 1977, and on August 1st, 1978, their daughter was born. Christina Sunshine Jung, named after George's father and the state of Florida where she came into the world. For a brief moment, George had everything: the money, the wife, the baby. the respect of the most violent men in the Western Hemisphere. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is how fast it all started to come apart. You have to understand the lifestyle these people were living. Mirtha and George were not only selling cocaine, they were swimming in it. Both of them developed serious addictions through the late 70s and early 80s. They fought constantly. Mirtha was once arrested while pregnant with Christina. Their fights got physical. The cash kept coming. The connections kept growing, but the marriage was collapsing in real time. And little Christina, the daughter they both adored, was growing up in a house full of armed men, paranoid arguments, and mountains of white powder on glass tables. Here's where Blow, the movie, takes some real liberties. In the film, the character Diego Delgado, played by Jordi Mola, is the slick Colombian who introduces George to Pablo Escobar and then betrays him by cutting him out of the operation. Diego Delgado is a composite character. He is partly Carlos Leder, partly Cesar Toban, and partly a third figure named Humberto Hoyos. The real betrayal didn't come from one man. It came from the slow erosion of trust between George Jung and the cartel itself. By the early 80s, Leder was becoming uncontrollable. He bought a Colombian political party. He gave fascist speeches. He declared himself a Nazi sympathizer on national television. Pablo Escobar wanted distance from him, and George Jung, the American partner, was suddenly the wrong man in the wrong room. In 1984, two things happened that broke George's world apart. The Bahamian government, under massive American pressure, finally moved on Norman's Cay. Later, fled into Colombia. The Medellin cartel restructured its supply lines and started using Mexican pilots and routes that didn't need a middleman from Massachusetts. And Mirtha, exhausted, addicted, terrified for her daughter, filed for divorce. The marriage was officially over in 1984. Christina was 6 years old. She would barely see her father in person again for the next 30 years. George kept moving product, but the operation was shrinking. The cartel didn't need him the way it used to. He was running smaller deals out of California now, working with old contacts, trying to maintain a lifestyle he could no longer afford. The DEA was watching. Federal agents had been collecting wiretap evidence for years. The walls were closing in, and George knew it. Then came the deal that nobody in the trade ever talked about openly. In 1987, Carlos Leder was captured in Colombia, extradited to the United States, and put on trial in Jacksonville, Florida. The federal government wanted a conviction badly. They needed a witness who could put Leder at the center of the cocaine pipeline. They came to George Jung, and George, facing his own mounting charges, sat down on the witness stand and testified against the man who had been his cellmate, his partner, his brother in the trade. Leder was convicted in 1988. He received a sentence of life without parole plus 135 years. George Jung had just signed his own death warrant, in the eyes of every cartel man in the hemisphere. But it bought him time, and time was the only currency he had left. The final fall came on a winter day in 1994. George was running one last load, 1,754 pounds of cocaine, moving through Topeka, Kansas. The DEA had him under surveillance the entire route. They arrested him without firing a shot. The man who had once partied at Pablo Escobar's mansion was now sitting in a federal holding cell in Kansas, 52 years old, broke, divorced, and out of moves. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy. The judge handed down a sentence of 60 years. 60 years for a man already in his 50s. Functionally, a life sentence. He served his time at Otisville Federal Correctional Institution in New York. 20 years in a cell. 20 years to think about every choice he had ever made. He started writing letters. He worked in the prison garden. He read everything he could get his hands on. And in 2001, the movie Blow came out. Johnny Depp visited him in prison to prepare for the role. The film made George Jung a household name. It romanticized him in places. It softened the violence of what he had really been part of. But it also captured with painful accuracy the loss of his daughter. The hallucinated reunion at the end of the movie. The older George imagining a visit from Christina that never came. That part was real. For most of his prison years, Christina refused to see him. She had been raised by relatives. She had her own life. She did not want to be the daughter of Boston George. The man on the witness stand, the cocaine cowboy. She wanted to be left alone. George wrote her letters. Some she answered, most she did not. He told reporters from his cell that the one thing he wanted before he died was to hold his daughter and his grandchild. For decades, he didn't get it. In June of 2014, after nearly 20 years inside, George Jung walked out of Fort Dix Federal Correctional Institution. He was 71 years old. He had no money. He had no career. He had a parole agreement that restricted everything from his travel to who he could speak to. He moved into a halfway house in San Diego. He started giving paid interviews. He wrote a memoir called Heavy. He signed merchandise deals. He spoke at colleges. The man who had once moved billions in cocaine was now charging $200 for autographs at true crime conventions. He met his grandson. He reconciled, slowly and painfully, with Christina. The TMZ photos from 2014 show George holding his daughter for the first time in decades, a frail old man clinging to a young woman who had every reason to keep him at arm's length. She forgave him. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. There was one more stumble. In 2016, he violated parole, was sent back to prison briefly, and was released for good in 2017. He returned to Weymouth, Massachusetts. The same small town he had left almost 60 years before chasing California sunshine and easy money. He lived quietly. He battled liver and kidney failure. The drugs that had made him rich had also destroyed his body. On May 5, 2021, he died in hospice care. He was 78 years old. So what really happened to the people behind one of the biggest cocaine stories ever told? Carlos later served 33 years in American federal prison. He was released in 2020 and deported to Germany, where he holds citizenship through his father. He lives quietly there to this day, a free man in his 70s. Pablo Escobar, the kingpin who had once called George Jung El Americano, was killed on a rooftop in Medellin on December 2, 1993. Mirtha Jung got clean. She moved to Florida, raised her daughter, and rebuilt her life away from the trade. She has spoken in interviews about her sobriety, her regret, and her quiet pride in Christina. Christina Sunshine Jung is now a mother herself. She runs a small clothing brand called Boston George, partly inspired by her father's nickname. She has spoken openly about the years of pain, the abandonment, the addiction in her family, and the slow road to forgiveness. The character Tuna in the film, the loyal childhood friend, is based loosely on a real Weymouth associate of George's, though the film compresses several real people into one. Many of the smaller players, the pilots, the stewardesses, the warehouse men, the bag carriers, were arrested through the 80s and 90s, served their sentences, and disappeared back into ordinary American life. Here's what this story actually reveals. The Medellin cartel did not flood America with cocaine by accident. It needed an American partner, somebody who understood the airports, the highways, the dealer networks, the culture. George Jung was that partner. He was not Pablo Escobar's equal, no matter how the movie framed it. He was a contractor, a very good one. And when the contractor became inconvenient, the organization moved on without him. That is the truth of every drug story. The product is bigger than the people who move it. The system swallows everyone, the foot soldiers, the cellmates, the wives, the children, eventually even the kings. George Jung made hundreds of millions of dollars. He helped a single Colombian organization become wealthier than most countries. He fathered a daughter he would not properly know until he was an old man. He testified against his closest partner. He spent more than 25 years of his life in federal cells. And he died in the same town where he was born, with nothing left but a memoir, a movie, and a daughter he had finally been allowed to love. The movie Blow ended with an aging George imagining his daughter walking through the prison gates. The real ending was quieter. A hospice bed, May 5th, 2021. A man who had once owned the route from Medellin to Boston, lying in a small Massachusetts room, breathing his last. That is the real story behind Blow. Not the glamour, not the parties, not the cash. The $100 million lesson: you do not beat the trade. The trade outlives you. If you found this story compelling, hit subscribe. We drop a new deep dive every week. Leave a comment. Who do you want covered next? Frank Lucas, Griselda Blanco, the Cali brothers. Tell us below.